Most people spend their whole lives reading the tax code like a threat. They look at it the way a rabbit looks at a fence. Something in front of them. Something built by somebody else. Something meant to keep them in one place while money gets taken out of their paycheck in orderly little bites. I used to watch people do this and think they were staring at the same machine I was, but they were not. They were looking at a bill. That difference changes everything. The average person thinks taxes are simple. Earn money. Government takes some, try to keep what is left. Maybe put a little in a retirement account. Maybe pray the market behaves. Maybe one day, if life is kind and inflation is sleepy, the pile is big enough to let you stop working. That is the consumer path. The consumer path gets taxed first and thinks later. The investor path thinks first and gets taxed on what remains after incentives. Depreciation, credits, structure, and ownership have done their work. This is what most people never understand. The tax code is not mainly a punishment document. It is an instruction manual. It is the government telling you, in thousands of pages of ugly language, what it wants built badly enough that it is willing to pay private citizens to build it. Housing, energy, technology, infrastructure, productive assets. They cannot create those things the way actual owners and operators can. Governments can order, they can regulate, they can announce, they can borrow, they can spend. But they do not create the way a builder creates, the way an investor allocates, the way an entrepreneur risks capital, the way an operator puts a real asset to work. That is why the tax code bends toward owners. If the country wants more housing, it rewards people who provide housing. If the country wants more energy, it rewards people who fund energy. If the country wants more technology, it rewards people who put capital behind technology. This is not a loophole. It is not a gray area. It is not a secret club. It is published policy for anyone patient enough to stop reading the code like a victim and start reading it like an allocator. Now, I want to make something very clear before I go any further. I am not talking about fake sophistication. I am not talking about the sort of cocktail party nonsense where someone says, put it on the business, as if spending $1 to save 30 cents makes them a genius. That is not what I mean when I say the government will pay you for life if you invest the right way. Write-offs are the appetizer. The real meal is depreciation, the dessert is tax credits. And the real magic happens when you combine those with something far more powerful than either one on its own. Other people's money, that is the machine. Most people have a childish understanding of how taxes work. They think if you spend money on an expense, you deduct the expense, and that is the win. But you still spent the money, the dollar is gone. You simply reduce the tax, but it is not the game I am interested in. I am interested in a different game. I want the government to help finance the acquisition of productive assets. I want to buy a machine and have the tax code hand me back enough cash flow, deductions, or credits that the machine begins paying for itself with my tax bill as the first fuel source. That is a much more interesting game. That is where the map starts to matter. The reason depreciation is so powerful is simple. The government recognizes that certain productive assets wear down, get used up, require maintenance, or lose economic life over time. So the code allows owners to deduct that decline in value against taxable income. But the investor who understands the map takes it further. He does not merely wait for slow depreciation over many years. If the rules allow acceleration, he looks for places where the code lets him front, load the deductions, and change the entire timing of the cash flow. Timing is everything in finance. A dollar returned to you today is not just a dollar. It is capital that can be redirected. It is a worker you can hire into the compounding machine right now instead of 10 years from now. And if you redirect that dollar into another productive asset, and that second asset produces more deductions, more income, more collateral, or more growth, then what looked like a tax strategy stops being a tax strategy. It becomes a flywheel. That is what I want you to see. Most people think taxes are the end of the wealth story. The intelligent investor understands taxes can be the beginning of the next investment cycle. That is the first mechanism. I call it the incentive map. The government points at what it wants and says, build this and I will make the path easier. The second mechanism is accelerated paper loss. That is depreciation doing in year one what ordinary people think only happens slowly over a decade or two. When you can compress years of tax benefit into the front end of an investment, you change the economics of the investment dramatically. The third mechanism is borrowed fuel, that is other people's money, debt, financing, credit lines, collateralized loans. The point is not to be reckless. The point is to recognize that the tax code generally does not care whether the asset was funded entirely with your own cash. If you acquire the qualifying asset, you often receive the depreciation or credit based on the asset itself, not on how emotionally attached you felt to the dollars used to buy it. That distinction is so powerful, most people miss it because they are still trapped in the consumer mindset. Consumers think, I spent $1. Owners think, I acquired an asset. Those are different sentences. The fourth mechanism is the reinvestment loop. That is where the whole thing begins to feel unfair to people who never learned the map. Because once the first refund, deduction, or tax savings comes back, the consumer sees relief. The owner sees fresh capital to deploy. Again, that is how wealth starts compounding faster than income. That is the secret most people miss. They think rich people get rich because they make more. Sometimes they do, but a lot of them get rich because the same dollar moves through a better loop. Now, let me walk you through 4 examples, because abstraction without examples leaves too much room for fantasy. The first one is technology, and the version I want to use is Bitcoin mining equipment, because it is one of the clearest illustrations of how this system can work. Strip away the politics and the personalities for a moment. What are Bitcoin miners in tax terms? They are productive equipment, specialized machines, capital assets. They cost money up front. They produce output over time. And because they qualify as equipment, the tax code can allow accelerated depreciation on the purchase. That is what matters. Suppose you have substantial taxable income. The ordinary person thinks the problem is how much the government will take. The map reader asks a different question. What productive equipment can I acquire that qualifies for accelerated depreciation and also produces a scarce asset I want to own? That is a very different thought process. If I acquire the mining equipment, and if the rules allow me to take a large portion or all of the depreciation in year one, then I have just moved the tax bill off the passive, helpless consumer track and onto the productive owner track. The government was going to take the money. Instead, a large part of that economic value got redirected into a machine that now works for me. And that machine is not dead after the tax event. It produces Bitcoin. So now I have not merely reduced the tax hit. I have converted future tax pain into a current productive asset. That is what makes this so attractive conceptually. The machine does not disappear after April. It keeps mining. If Bitcoin rises, the economics improve. If network conditions change favorably, the economics improve. If I then borrow against the output or against other assets to fund more equipment, the flywheel begins. That is not magic, that is map reading. The tax savings reduces the pain of acquisition, the machine produces output, the output becomes collateral or capital. The next round becomes easier. Do that once and you save taxes. Do that repeatedly and you built a system. Now the second example is real estate. And this one is older than nearly every tax argument in America. People like real estate because it feels real. You can touch it, you can visit it, you can improve it, you can borrow against it, other people can pay you to use it. That is all fine. But the real reason sophisticated investors love real estate is not because houses are romantic. It is because the tax code has spent generations rewarding ownership of income, producing property. The average person understands one thin slice of this. They know a rental property can be depreciated over time. What they often do not understand is that not all the value inside a property has to move on the same slow schedule if the rules and studies are properly used. A cost segregation study can break out components of a property into shorter life buckets, allowing much more depreciation up front. That matters tremendously. Now the property is no longer merely an income-producing asset. It becomes a front-loaded tax machine, And if you structure it properly, especially in a format where the losses are actually usable to you, then the government is again helping fund the acquisition. This is where I want you to stop thinking like a shopper and start thinking like a capital allocator. If I buy a productive property and the tax benefit from accelerated depreciation creates enough economic relief to offset a meaningful part of the initial capital I had to commit, then my actual out-of-pocket experience is very different from what the sticker price suggested, and then the property still sits there, collecting rent, rising or falling with the market, serving as collateral and giving me optionality. That is not just a tax trick, that is balance sheet construction. And if the property is unique, experiential, or located in a market where the building itself represents a large chunk of the purchase value, the math gets even more interesting because the depreciable base is larger relative to the land. That is not just a real estate detail, that is tax architecture. The investor who understands that is not buying a house. He is buying depreciation, optionality, rent streams, collateral, and long-duration scarcity, all in one asset. That is a very different mindset from the person who just thinks they bought a rental. Now let us move to the third example, oil and gas. This is one of the oldest incentive maps in the code because the country has always needed energy and has always struggled to produce enough of it without private capital taking real risk. So what does the government do? It says, if you put money into drilling, development, and production, I will let you deduct a large portion of what you spent very quickly. Again, not because it is a loophole, because they want the wells drilled. That is the entire point. What makes this especially powerful is the treatment of intangible drilling costs. A huge portion of the capital can often be deducted immediately. That changes the economics dramatically. The investor is no longer just making a commodity bet. He is making a commodity bet with a tax subsidy attached to the entry point. That matters. If I can put money into an energy program and get a large immediate deduction while also retaining the upside of production, then again, the tax system is not merely reducing pain. It is helping me acquire a productive income stream. This is the part people do not grasp. They think the deduction is the payoff. No, the deduction is the accelerant. The payoff is owning the well. The income rights, the production stream, or the participation in the asset after the government helps soften the first hit. Now, of course, this kind of investment has real operating risk, commodity price risk, counterparty risk, timing risk, and all the usual ugliness that comes with real assets in the real world. I am not pretending otherwise. But if you understand the map, you can at least see why this path exists. The country wants energy. Energy producers require capital, so the tax code rewards capital that goes there. Simple. Housing, energy, technology. The map keeps repeating the same message. Now the fourth example is solar, and this one is a little different because it can involve something even more valuable than depreciation. A credit. Credits are beautiful because a deduction reduces taxable income. A credit reduces tax liability directly. That is a much sharper tool. If I owe $1 of tax and I have $1 of credit, the credit wins directly against the bill. That is what makes solar so interesting in certain setups. Not only can you have depreciation, you can also have a credit layer. So the government is not just saying we will let you write this down over time. It is saying we will hand you a coupon directly against the tax bill for funding the type of build-out we want. That is very powerful. And then, just like the other examples, the asset remains. The system keeps producing. Whether it produces bill savings, lease revenue, usage revenue, or some other form of economic output depends on structure. But the same core logic remains. The government wanted more of the thing, private capital built the thing, the tax code subsidized the build. That is the whole movie. Now, when you step back and look at these four examples together, a pattern emerges. The map is always pushing money toward things the government wants, but cannot efficiently build a computing infrastructure, housing, energy, solar. The specifics change, the incentives change, the percentages change, the rules change, but the pattern does not change. The government cannot create. It can only redirect. Owners create, investors allocate, builders, and the tax code exists to bribe capital into going where the state wants it to go. Once you see that, a lot of financial confusion falls away. You stop asking, how do I pay less tax? You start asking, what does the government want badly enough that it is willing to subsidize me for funding it? That is a much richer question, and now I want to come to the most important part of all, the flywheel. Because a one-time tax strategy is useful, a repeating tax flywheel is life-changing. Suppose I redirect tax dollars into a productive asset. Suppose that asset gives me depreciation, credits, income, and maybe appreciation. Suppose I then take the tax savings, or the cash flow, or the collateral value, and use it to acquire more productive assets. Now the flywheel starts. The first asset helps fund the second helps fund the third. The tax relief stops being a temporary reward and becomes capital for the next round. This is how the same income can create a completely different balance sheet outcome over time. Most people think wealth is built mainly by increasing income. Increasing income helps, of course, but wealth is often built faster by increasing loop quality. If two people earn the same amount, but one is living on the consumer path and the other is running the investor loop, they are not living the same financial life, even if their salary is identical. The consumer earns, gets taxed, spends, and hopes. The owner earns, redirects, acquires, depreciates, credits, compounds, borrows intelligently, reinvests, and repeats. Same income. Completely different destiny. That is why this system matters so much. The government is not literally mailing you a lifetime pension for being clever. What it is doing is better. It is giving you the chance to route tax dollars into productive assets that can then continue producing for years or decades if you build the loop correctly. That is what people mean when they say the government pays them for life. It is not the first refund that matters. It is the machine that first refund helps you own. And I think that distinction is one of the most important distinctions in personal finance. A lot of people chase tax savings the way a child chases candy. They want the relief, they want the dopamine, they want to say they beat the government. That is a small mind. The serious investor does not chase savings. He chases the right to own better assets with dollars that would otherwise have gone to the government. That is the larger game, and it requires one identity shift more than anything else. You have to stop thinking like a consumer. Consumers see taxes as something done to them. Owners see taxes as part of the capital allocation system. Consumers ask, what is the bill? Owners ask, what is the map? Consumers want the refund. Owners want the flywheel. Consumers are amazed rich people use the code. Owners are amazed ordinary people never read the instructions. So if I were explaining this in the plainest Buffett language possible, I would say it like this. The tax code is not mainly a punishment system. It is an incentive system disguised as a punishment system. If you stay on the consumer path, all you mostly experience is the punishment. If you move on to the owner path, you start discovering the incentives were there all along. That does not mean every incentive is good. It does not mean every project should be funded. It does not mean every tax advantaged idea is intelligent. It simply means the map exists, and people who ignore maps rarely end up somewhere good by accident. Now, none of this works without judgment. A tax credit cannot save a bad asset forever. Depreciation cannot turn a foolish operator into a smart one. Borrowed money can amplify stupidity just as efficiently as it amplifies brilliance. If you use leverage carelessly, if you buy assets you do not understand, if you chase incentives without evaluating the underlying machine, then the map will still let you drive off a cliff. So judgment comes first, always, but for the investor with judgment, this whole system becomes incredibly powerful. You can use technology incentives to acquire productive machines. You can use real estate rules to redirect tax pain into appreciating an income. Producing property, you can use energy incentives to own production streams. You can use solar credits and depreciation to have the government fund much of the build. And then, most importantly, you can use the savings and output from one round to help fund the next. That is the loop. That is the real wealth system. Not one deduction, not one refund. A loop, and loops beat salaries. That is one of the oldest truths in capitalism. So if you want to know what I would do with this information, I would begin very simply. I would stop asking only how much tax I owe. I would ask what productive assets the government is currently subsidizing, which of those I actually understand, which of those fit my risk tolerance, and whether I am willing to become the kind of person who reads the map instead of complaining about the tolls. That is the dividing line. Not rich versus poor, not sophisticated versus unsophisticated, reader of the map versus payer of the bill. And once you cross that line, your financial life starts to look very different. Not overnight, not magically, but permanently, because the tax code stops being a dead end and starts becoming an on-ramp to ownership. And ownership, if it is productive and intelligently financed, is one of the few forces in life that can keep paying long after the first work is done. That is how the government pays you for life. Not by generosity, by incentives. And if you learn to follow them, you stop handing your future to the tax bill and start recruiting the tax bill into your balance sheet.